So today we're going to talk about this idea of evidence-based practice, kind of introduce the topic. A couple of housekeeping type announcements as far as how this kind of goes for this class. Remember, there are no tests. So so there's really no need to like take notes. I would rather you kind of listen and just kind of experience what we're talking about and think about more, what does this mean to me? If you get away like one or two things, then you've successfully got through these introduction lessons, right? Normally we will not have lessons like this, but we're just still introducing the topic. Normally it will just be, hey, let me go over the assignment. Let's do the assignment, okay? Secondly, you guys on Canvas will have much longer PowerPoints than I present. Part of that is for some background information for you guys. Like, I don't make you do a reading for this section. So I give you that for additional whatever. Okay, so just kind of sit back, relax. If you have questions or something, or you want to talk about something more, let me know. Otherwise, I want you to just kind of get a general sense of what we're doing. Fair enough? All right. So I introduced this class a little bit in the first lesson, talking about how this is going to be the writing class. And you have to take 2 writing classes. But I am very well aware of the fact that you guys are exercise science majors, and writing a standard essay in exercise science will never happen, right? It just doesn't. Right? I mean, the athlete and coach, narrative, like the dumb jock, isn't necessarily true, but there's always an element of that. They're not going to sit down and read a nice 5-part essay. That just doesn't happen. So how do we go about doing that? And how is this going to benefit you guys? That's what I want you guys to focus on today. However, I'm also a realist as well. The real question in your back of your mind is, how do I even start a project that's 100% of my grade not due for 12 weeks? Right? Anybody ever do a project for 12 weeks before? No, right? When they say semester project, they might as well say project done in the last 2 to 4 weeks of the semester, right? And then that's what they should say. And then in reality, project done in the last few days of the semester, right? That's what semester projects are. I was a student. I'm good with that. Legitimately, this entire class is based off of this project. But it really isn't about writing, which is the weird part, right? It's really not about writing. All this is a way of thinking with a standardized reporting form, so that way your audience only has to read what is most interesting to them. So don't think of this as a writing assignment. Think of this as a process that has a written report at the end that is standardized. And as I stated before, but I want to come back to, the entire secret to this class is to stay caught up and to volunteer to be the example. So that way I write it on the board or we write it together. I am totally cool with that because we will think through the process together. And if this is really about a method of thinking and not about the writing, then does it really matter whose exact words were chosen, as long as you're doing the thinking? Okay? So this is what we're going to kind of focus on over the next 2 days. kind of come back to how decisions are made in real life, so that way you don't think I was just totally nuts with regards to our last assignment. So in order to do that, I want to start with this question. Do you ever think it's too cold to exercise or run outside? How many people say, yes, it can be too cold to run outside? And I mean, ever does not mean, you know, like absolute zero. Don't get me wrong. But like, is there probably a point where you should not exercise outside? How many people say that no, you know, you can probably run outside, you know, during most normal situations? You know, I apparently need more cross-country runners, because cross-country runners never, you know, stop running outside. I mean, unless like they can't see, they're going to run outside, right? And I'm not saying I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just saying that's what they do. Here's my real question for you, though. How'd you come up with that answer in like 30 seconds? Experience? Same thing? Well, now, if you've experienced running or exercising out in the cold, I think the problem first and foremost is you're exercising or running. That's just weird. No, I'm just kidding. Right? See, I prefer to learn through other people's experiences, especially when it comes to exercise. Right? No, not really, but it makes for a funnier joke. And like, I have to talk a lot today, so I have to try to do something to get you guys engaged, because normally I feed off of the emotions of you guys to begin with. You know, you're all there, and then you have these masks on, and so I can't even tell if Evan is smiling at me or about to fall asleep. So, right, when we use personal experiences or the experience of others, that has a specific name. That's anecdotal evidence. Anybody ever heard of that? Right? That's just the term. It is very efficient. However, there's a large emotional component. How many people judged off of the fact that they said that it can be too cold to run or exercise outside because they ran or exercised outside and it was really cold and they hated it? Right? Yeah, that'd be me, right? That would be me, right? So it really wasn't as much about whether or not it was efficient or that was a good use of your time, or whether or not that was safe or unsafe. It was unpleasant, right? Whether you felt like it was effective or not, right? You can think of things in your experience. I mean, when you were talking about buying headphones, the most common thing that came up was, you know, either I've had a pair similar to this or friends do, right? Very efficient, very effective. That's how you make a lot of decisions, right? But from that, it's limited, obviously, to who your friends are and what your experiences are. When you're just buying a pair of headphones, it really doesn't matter that much. But if you really wanted to try to come up with the best decisions, right, you then start to go a little bit farther, and you see some of these, as you guys described, how you make some more life decisions, right? And that's heuristics. Heuristics are the idea of these rules of thumb, right, or basic processes that can be used to make decisions. Right? You can think of a bazillion of these, right? Whether or not they're right or wrong doesn't really matter. It's an element of truth. And in fact, you know, when you get enough people doing the same thing, we stop calling it heuristics and start calling it best practices. Right? The idea is that there's knowledge in the masses. Yeah, and there's a lot of truth to that. Everybody brings a little bit more to that. But as you can figure out with that, and right, wrong, or indifferent, during today's day and age, there is a lot of best practices thought that is just the opinion or advice of a lot of possibly really smart people. But at that same note, you can get to this idea of groupthink. Even experts are subject to this idea of groupthink. If you never heard of groupthink or read anything about that, it's worth your time. There's probably some like Google videos or something on it to make it easier. But this whole idea of group dynamics and how just being in a group affects decision-making process is worth knowing. So that way, hopefully you can counter some of that and you're not one of the ones that just goes over the cliff. Right, and so you can see how the experiences of anecdotal and heuristic evidence can lead to less than optimal advice or outcomes. Right? And we saw that primarily in the pot roast story. Nothing really wrong with cutting the ends off of the pot roast, except think about that meat. Like, I like meat. Anybody else like meat? Right? You're throwing away good meat. That is less than ideal. Right? And when you have less than ideal or decisions that can occur, those future decisions then can be based off of the effects of a previous decision, off of a previous decision, off a previous decision. And that can either lead to more options or less options. And this is actually a picture of the Cascade Tunnel, right, where the rockets had to go through. Now, in reality, with that, they sure could have found a different way to ship the rockets, right? But this idea of one decision leading to possibly a reduction of choices in the future can become problematic. Kind of like the Browns relying on just, a few young linebackers and one gets hurt and now you're relying on nobody, right? Decreased options. So we're educated. We live in the information revolution, right? The information age. You ever hear that, right? Information age. We got all sorts of information, more information that goes through. We are too smart to just rely on heuristics or rule of thumb because we've got all this information at our fingertips. However, there's just one problem with that. When you're creating as much information, as much content as we are, I would hate to be a historian trying to write about today and writing about the year 2020. Where do you start? Right? I mean, you just start going through people's Twitter feeds, right? I mean, historians used to love journals, right? Somebody that wrote journals would really inflect history. Now we got everybody in the world writing down all of their thoughts on Facebook and Twitter, right? But where do you start? That's the problem that we deal with today. There's just too much information. Too much information. If you decided on the headphones project, right, that I'm going to read everything that I can about choosing the right headphones, you would still be reading. Would you maybe make a better decision on what headphones to buy? Yeah, possibly. I mean, like I said, and I was in a half-joking manner, part of the reason why I signed this, because I'm always interested in new gadgets. Not that I can really bring myself to spend $300 on a pair of headphones right now. I got kids, so they spend money for me. But at that note, you guys are going to bring in things I would never even considered. But what we need then is a systematic approach. We need to figure out what matters and get that information in the most efficient model as possible so we can apply it. Right? We want to make good decisions, but we don't want the process to become the decision. Right? You can't miss the deadline to write about what headphones you're going to pick because you're still searching for information on headphones. And that's the way that things work on a regular basis. So before we get too far down the line, I really want to make sure we're all on the same page as far as what we're talking about. And we're talking about the basic research process that you've all heard about since you go back to the original scientific method that they teach you, back in elementary school. Nothing's changed with that. We're just going to create a process for doing that, right? So the same process of data observations and experiments, analyzing the data, right? Determining the results, finding the conclusions, blah, 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 right? The same process that's always been done. One thing on that I want to make sure you understand before we move forward is this idea of applied versus basic research. And this becomes really, really important. Okay? Basic research is usually done with modeling and animal physiology studies. You then apply that to a theory, which will then affect outcomes. So, for example, let's use ultrasound. Have anybody ever had ultrasound, therapeutic ultrasound done to them? Anybody ever wonder what the hell it was doing? No? Somebody else have a better example? Next, this is going to be a long class because I hear myself in my ear and I'm the only one talking. All right, we'll go back to ultrasound. So ultrasound. Ultrasound passes electricity through this crystal. As the electricity passes through the crystal vibrates, creating sound waves, and it sends the sound waves out through the sound head. Right? The idea is those sound waves will then vibrate the cells and the different material within your body. Vibrations will then cause heat. Heat will then increase cell metabolism as well as cell elongation, right? Which will lead to both improved healing as well as increased range of motion. Right? Cool. So most of the research on ultrasound is basic science research. We take an ultrasound unit, we turn it on, we apply it, we apply the thing, we stick a temperature probe down in your leg, and we see if the temperature increases. And at the end of that, if the temperature increases, we say the ultrasound works. Okay? Right? Good. Basic science. There's only one problem with basic science research. Do any of you guys ever care what the internal temperature of your quad is? No. Even if you have a quad strain? No, right? What do you care about? Yeah, do you feel better? Do you have more range of motion, more strength? Can I get my butt back out on the playing field, right? Foam rolling, all those sorts of things, right? Yeah, I mean, like, what is it doing, right? And so that's the important aspect with this, that this idea of basic research, which basic research is really easy to do and it's really controlled. That's why we do it. Applied research is more clinical in nature. The question would then be, we do the ultrasound and we see if we can get our butts out on the field faster by doing ultrasound. Problem with that is there's all sorts of confounding variables within that. But it's important, and the reason I pause here is it's important to realize as we go through these different aspects that the research process is always either basic science or practical or somewhere in between. It's on this continuum. And we have to appreciate that continuum. The other real problem as we look into this research aspect that's important to understand is research is only as good as the question that it's trying to answer. This is the really crappy thing about trying to do research. If I want to know whether or not ultrasound works, I've got to test different ultrasound units at different intensities, on different outcomes for different durations. Everything I can manipulate needs to be manipulated, and the question is only as good as that one portion of manipulation. So as you go through and we're looking at this and we're reading research and we're going through this process, we need to be able to differentiate between basic and applied research, and we need to be able to match questions, right? So that is the process we're going to do. But we're not going to do it in this normal aspect of research that you would think of. We're going to do secondary research or summative research, and we call this evidence-based practice. Right, kind of a catchy term, people probably heard it, right? But what it is important to try to understand, because this is the process we're talking about. An evidence-based practice is simply a way of thinking that hopefully leads us to better outcomes in whatever we're trying to do, right? Whether we're trying to win games, improve healing, right? Better education techniques, we need to find a way, and that's what evidence-based practice is. So evidence-based practice is the journey. That's the important thing. It is the journey. And so we will spend more time talking about evidence-based practice and the different components than anything else. And that will be our journey as well. We haven't even gotten any chuckles or anything about, I know. Not even the time to drop, I guess it must just be too late or whatever. I mean, but seriously, what kind of professor does do color commentary on their own lecture? One that secretly wants to be teaching in front of all of those people. Right? I'm halfway there, I got the microphone on. No. There could be thousands of people on this Zoom call. We don't know. No, because that would make me incredibly nervous. How many people have seen the movie Good Will Hunting? Right? Good movie. I love at the beginning, I think it's in the beginning, where the professor is and is like, blah, 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 and that's the end. If you have any questions, I'm sure whoever has the answer, and his teaching assistants, and they all applaud. Right? Talk about awesome. At the end of the lesson, you go, peace out. Questions go to somebody, less important than me. You're welcome. This little thing is an educational technique called, the midterm break. Because, I already went too long at about 25 minutes. and your attention span's not that long, so I've got to do something in between. Normally I'd have you do like breaths of fire or something to get you guys pumped up, but apparently heavy breathing is not appropriate. And you almost pass out when doing it normally. With a mask, you would all pass out, and then that would decrease the amount of time we would have left over. So no, we did not go off on a tangent. We're just taking a little mental break. And we're back. All right, so intro to evidence-based practice. Any questions? That was a dumb question. Anybody want to talk? I did ask for the record reflect. Oh, good. Yes.
Which one do you find more useful? Applied or basic? Or is it just situational?
Well, I mean, everything's situational, so I always feel that that's a little bit of a cop-out sort of thing, right? Practical research is always better. The problem is their question and your question have to exactly match, right? I mean, one of the biggest problems with like research is it's often done on, you know, college freshmen, right? I mean, most psychology research is done on college freshmen because they're in Psych 101 and they require them to do it, or they give them extra credit or something. And then we assume that the rest of the population is like college freshmen. So that's where, you know, like if I can get a study on football players, right, that's going to be very different than the same study done on cross-country athletes. Now, so basic science will allow me to guess more, but applied research is always ideal. All right, evidence-based practice, I have to read the definition. It is required in all lessons with that. It's the explicit and conscientious attempts to find the best available research evidence to assist health professionals to make the best decisions for their patients. Right? And we've kind of guessed at that. But when we look at this, it is, as we said, the attempts in the process, not the end result, and it has to be about these patients. When we talk about evidence, though, one of the biggest knocks against evidence-based practice is this definition of evidence, this thought that all this is randomized controlled trials, you know, like reading research in different aspects. And it really is more than that. You see these overlapping Venn diagrams regularly. Either there's 3, or there's with the 4th all the way around, or like this picture with the 4th in there. But it's the patient's values, the clinical expertise, research evidence, all within the practice context. All right. The idea being that you need to apply research. That's part of this process. You need to include your own expertise, whether or not, you know, things that you've done becomes important as well. What your patient is, and then, you know, this idea of practice context comes from the standpoint, it doesn't really matter if the best intervention for you and for you need is a $10 million machine if you don't have $10 million, right? And to believe otherwise is just wrong. So it's not clinical guidelines. And this is more for the medical people in the room, this idea that, you know, you read these clinical guidelines, these position statements, and evidence-based practice is like following them to the T, right? That's not evidence-based practice, that's just a part. It's not these randomized controlled trials or just the things you read about the research, right? It is taking all of that and mixing it together in this process. And the way we mix that together will end up being within our question. We'll spend time about the question here in like a week or so when we start with our own questions. So when you think about this and why it matters, there's all sorts of different reasons with that. But if I could give you one main reason why evidence-based practice is worth learning about and figuring out and why this is worth it, it's because in the long run, it will save you lots and lots of time. And I say that because in the fields of medicine and exercise science and athletics, right, you combine all those together, there is a prevailing wisdom that more is better. Right? I'm going to pick on the football team just a little bit. Right? You guys meet more than any class on campus half the times, right? And I think sometimes you meet because the NCAA lets you meet. Right? We have a meeting scheduled, so we must show up. Right? You ever been to a meeting? It's like, I got really nothing new to talk about. Quarterbacks, receivers, right? Linebackers, they probably need to meet more than the average, right? Because things change a lot more for them. Right? Rudy, the running plays don't change based on who's on the other side of the thing. Their defensive scheme, fairly irrelevant. It may take you, what, half hour to learn their blitz packages and what you might be needing to pay attention to. Defensive line is, I think, the best. I mean, they don't even line up, right? I mean, the linebacker's job is get their butt in the right place and then they go forward. There's only like 6 inches of space between them and the offensive lineman. What are they going to do? Am I lying? You can be dumb as a box of rocks, right? I mean, especially if you're like a big nose tackle type thing. My job is to eat up blockers so that the linebacker behind me can get the sexy tackles. Right? But we always expect more is more. It's no different in, sports medicine. We go downstairs, half of the stuff we're doing is just so that we can say we're doing something. Right? But if we start asking the question, what do we want out of this? And is this effective at getting it? If the answer is no, right? If we follow, evidence-based practice and the answer is no, then let's not do it. At the same note, if the answer is yes, then let's do more of that. Right? If the goal is to win, then we need to think about that as our goal, not filling the hours. Right? Now, there is all sorts of fairness thing and blah, 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 blah. So, there's reasons for that. But it just makes a good example. And I get to pick on, football players. Other criticisms of evidence-based practice is that it's too reliant on research. There's no place for the wise old man. It all ends up in a cookbook approach where we're all doing the same thing. But that's evidence-based practice done wrong, right? Because we saw in the previous picture of that evidence just is 1/4 of that. If evidence-based practice, right, is too reliant on the research, that means it's done wrong, because the wise old man has his place in there, right? Between the patient and then the context, right? That should mean that with each patient and in each context, there will be differences, which means it shouldn't be a cookie cutter approach. All right, so the process of evidence-based practice can be defined in these 5 A's. Ask a question, assess the information, praise the articles found, apply the information, and audit. I love this. They came up with audit, opposed to review because it came with an A. The other ones weren't too much of a stretch, but don't you just hate when they come up with the 5 A's? Makes great test questions, right? But we don't have tests. Why don't we just call this like reflect or review? I don't care, just anything else. That's why I put the little help. I hate alphabet soup stuff. So step 1, like I said, we'll spend a lot of time on asking the question, because if you don't have the right question, right, then the answer is irrelevant. So we can ask questions about anything with that, but our question has to be answerable. And that's where this comes into place. We need to know the what, right, of what we're researching and what we're looking at. But more importantly, then, we need to know the who, the how, and then the scoreboard. Because if we're playing different games, then you need different players. That's what ends up being the biggest problem, in my opinion. When people say things work or don't work, first question you have to ask is like, don't work or work at what? Right? I mean, you can use the mask example because that's all over in the big to-do about research right now. Do masks work? And people just argue yes or no. Right? Work at what? After we have that, then we can start to try to find the evidence that we need. And our question works as a spotlight to take all of the information in the world out there and bring it back to our what, right, and how, pretty much. So that makes it a lot easier. Once we get to that point, then we have to critically appraise the evidence. This is where you guys come into play as the person actually going to be implementing it. Now, you actually read the research and come up with an educated decision. I know, crazy. In today's day and age, I thought we'd just, wait for the newspaper to tell us. Right, but we go back to the source. And we appraise that source, not taking their words for it. I mean, how many, okay, you guys have written papers. How many people skip the methods and results and just read the introduction and discussion? Or the abstract, right? Heck, screw all of that. Go straight to the conclusions, baby. Right? Most important. Well, in order to be more effective at that, we need to be able to be skilled enough to come up with, are those appropriate conclusions? Step 4, we have to integrate. We actually have to do it. If we just spend the entire time thinking about it, it's not good. And then finally, we get back to reflecting on this process. How did it work for my patient population? So that's our first lesson on this introduction in evidence-based practice. We'll start next time on this clinical reasoning within evidence-based practice. How do we move a little bit farther on how we go about doing that? And that will be Wednesday. Friday, we have another online discussion. So I'll talk more about how to do that on Wednesday, but we will not be in class again on Friday, as we will do the same thing that we did this last Friday, because one, it works out well with how we're, the situations we're in. But two, like, I really have to admit, like, I am impressed with you guys as a group. Your discussions were great, thoughtful. All right, everybody gets a chance to talk or write because you have to. So I really like that, and I think you guys really got some, you know, not aha moments. It's not like, you know, we're inventing, you know, light bulbs or whatever. But I can already start to see some of this modes of thinking start to change and questions occur. And that's the real goal of these discussions. Right? Questions or anything I can do for you all? Rookie mistake, Nick. You don't wrap up class and then ask for questions. Right? Because then it's obvious that it's questions or go. Rookie mistake. Well, on that note, I won't make it awkward for the first person to get up and leave. I will just dismiss you. All right. And enjoy the rest of your day.